The house did not welcome him. It stood at the edge of a dead-end road in Pennsylvania, its frame sagging under the weight of a century. My cousin stepped through the front door, and the air inside felt heavy, thick with the scent of trapped dust and damp earth. Every footfall on the floorboards triggered a sharp rhythmic groan that seemed to echo long after he stopped moving. He spent the first few hours checking the locks, but the house felt less like a shelter and more like a cage. He found the landlord in the kitchen, a man who refused to meet his eyes. The man gestured toward the staircase with a hand that trembled slightly. He pointed to the top of the landing. "You can stay," the landlord said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly tone. "But there is one rule. Do not enter the upstairs back room. The lock is faulty, and it will not hold if you force it." My cousin looked up at the darkened hallway. He nodded, but as the landlord walked out the front door, the silence of the house returned, heavier than before. He stood alone in the dark. For 7 days, the farmhouse remained a tomb of silence. My cousin slept in the room directly below the forbidden door, lulled by the familiar groans of old wood and shifting beams. On the 8th night, the rhythm broke. At 2 a.m., the ceiling above his bed groaned under a sudden, concentrated weight. These were not the random pops of cooling timber. They were heavy, measured strides. Someone was pacing. He lay on his back, eyes wide, staring into the blackness. As the footsteps traveled from the wall to the center of the room and back again, each step landed with a dull, rhythmic thud that vibrated through the plaster. He held his breath, waiting for the house to settle. But the pacing continued for hours, relentless and precise. Then, the sound shifted. The pacing stopped, replaced by a slow, grating scrape. It sounded like a heavy trunk being dragged across the floorboards, inch by agonizing inch, toward the door. He gripped the edges of his mattress, his knuckles white, listening as the dragging stopped right above his head. The house was no longer empty. The next morning, he climbed the stairs with a flashlight, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knelt before the forbidden door. Near the floor, the wood was shredded. Deep, jagged gouges scarred the grain, as if something had been clawing to get out. He called the landlord, but the man only chuckled, dismissing the damage as old rot. Paranoia, he called it. My cousin did not believe him. He drove to town, bought a motion-activated camera, and mounted it in the hallway, aimed directly at the threshold. He retreated to his car, parked in the driveway, and watched the live feed on his phone. The screen showed the hallway, bathed in a dim, flickering light. At 3:14 a.m., the image jumped. The brass doorknob began to rotate. It turned slowly, once, then twice, the metal groaning under the pressure. Then, 3 sharp, rhythmic knocks struck the wood from the inside. The camera audio crackled, then cleared. A raspy, wet whisper filled the car. "He said, 'Don't let me out.'" The voice did not sound like a memory. It sounded like a warning. My cousin dropped the phone, his hands shaking. The next morning, the farmhouse felt colder, the air thick with a stagnant, metallic scent. My cousin returned with 2 friends, their faces pale, their movements tight with nervous energy. They stood before the forbidden door, the wood groaning under the pressure of a heavy crowbar. It took 3 brutal strikes to snap the rusted lock. The door swung open with a long, agonizing screech, revealing a windowless, barren space. The wallpaper was stained with dark, spreading dampness that looked like dried blood. In the center of the room sat a single, child-sized rocking chair, positioned to face the corner. My cousin stepped inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the dust-choked air. He stopped, dead. The walls were covered in thousands of tiny, frantic carvings, etched deep into the plaster. "I still live here." The repetition was suffocating. He turned to leave, but his breath hitched. The rocking chair was swaying back and forth. They scrambled out of the farmhouse, the sound of the rocking chair still echoing in the silence of his mind. My cousin tried to call the landlord, but the number was dead. The line simply clicked into a hollow void. He packed his belongings in a fever, left the farmhouse that same afternoon, and never looked back. Months later, the truth surfaced. The previous owner had imprisoned his wife in that room for years. She had perished there during a brutal winter, trapped in the dark. Yet, the memory that keeps him awake at night is not the frantic carvings or the raspy whisper. It is the chair. He knows that when they broke into that room, the chair was still swaying back and forth, as if someone had only just stood up to greet them. The house was empty, but the presence had been waiting. It started as a flicker in my peripheral vision. 8 months ago, I first noticed him at the corner coffee shop. He stood perfectly still, a figure in a gray hoodie, his face hidden beneath a low-hanging cap. I looked away, blinked, and when I turned back, he was gone. I dismissed it as a trick of the light. Then, I saw him again, standing across the street from my gym, motionless against the flow of traffic. Later that same afternoon, he was leaning against a concrete pillar in my office parking lot. He never moved. He never spoke. He simply stared, his posture rigid, his presence heavy. I walked toward him once, intent on demanding he stop following me. But as I reached the pillar, the air felt thin, like a vacuum, and he had already vanished. The stillness he projected made my skin crawl. It was not the behavior of a person waiting for a bus or meeting a friend. It was the calculated, relentless observation of something that did not belong. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see that gray shape. Every time I stopped, I felt the weight of that gaze pressing into my back. The coincidence had ended. The pursuit had begun. The sanctuary of my apartment dissolved within a week. I would leave my keys on the kitchen counter, only to find them tucked inside the bathroom drawer when I returned from work. I dismissed it as exhaustion, a lapse in memory, until the night I found my journal open on the desk. It was locked, yet the latch hung loose. I flipped through the pages, my pulse hammering against my ribs. New entries filled the margins, written in a script that mirrored my own handwriting with terrifying precision. These pages detailed events I had not yet lived. A grocery store accident, a missed train, a conversation with a stranger I had not yet met. The ink was fresh, still damp to the touch. I spent the night pacing, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner, every shifting floorboard. Then, at 3 a.m., the silence of the room was punctured by the vibration of my phone on the nightstand. The screen displayed a blocked number. I did not sleep for 2 days. I bought 3 cameras, mounting them in the corners of my bedroom, their lenses pointed directly at the bed. I sat in the living room, eyes glued to the monitor, waiting for the clock to strike 3. The timestamp flickered to 3 a.m. The screen remained dark for a long moment. Then the infrared light caught movement. He was there. He stood over my bed, a silent, unmoving pillar in the dark. I watched my own sleeping form on the screen, chest rising and falling in deep, rhythmic sleep. Then, I saw him lean closer. His lips began to move. I watched the monitor, my heart hammering against my ribs, and realized with a jolt of pure terror that his mouth was moving in perfect, sickening synchronization with my own breathing. He was not just watching, he was participating. I was dreaming of drowning, the sensation of water filling my lungs, and on the screen, he was mouthing the word water over and over, his expression unchanging, his gaze locked onto my sleeping face. The violation was absolute. He was inside the room, inside my dream, and he was feeding on the rhythm of my life. I reached out to touch the screen, but my hand shook so violently I had to pull away. The man in the dark did not look at the camera. He only looked at me. I did not wait for the sun. I found him on the sidewalk the next morning, standing in the exact spot where I had seen him weeks ago. I did not hesitate. I lunged forward and grabbed his arm. My fingers sank into something that felt like stone cold, unyielding, and devoid of any warmth. He turned his head slowly. A calm, terrifying familiarity settled over his features as he looked at me. I have been with you since you were little, he said. You just finally noticed. I pulled my hand away as if burned and ran. I reached my apartment, locked the door, and ripped every family album from the shelves. I tore through the pages, my hands trembling, until I saw him. There he was, a blurred shape in the background of my 5th birthday party, a shadow near the bleachers at my graduation, a dark smudge in the corner of the frame at my mother's funeral. He had been the silent witness to my entire life, a constant, unmoving presence in the periphery. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. There was no hiding from a shadow that had been cast before I was born. I grabbed a bag, threw in only the essentials, and left everything else behind. I drove 1,200 miles, changed my name, and locked myself in a new, unfamiliar apartment. For 2 weeks, the silence was absolute. I convinced myself the distance had worked. Then, this morning, I looked at the reflection in my window. He was there, standing in the street below, looking up at my floor. I checked the locks, but the feeling of being watched never faded. It grew heavier. I hear a rhythmic scratching inside the drywall now, a soft, deliberate sound of fingernails on plaster. It is not coming from outside anymore. The floorboard behind me just creaked. I am not alone in this room.